I think social media is bad, but the reason I think it's so bad for this generation is that we lost things to hold on to that give you stability and grounding. Having a community, having a sense of right and wrong, maybe from religion. With our generation, we're the first to have so many ways of simulating the thing that was lost. When they say they're socially anxious, they really are feeling it. But I think a part of that suffering is medicalising their normal distress and their normal human responses to things.
We're often told that Gen Z is the most connected and self-aware generation in history. Yet at the same time, we're seeing unprecedented levels of anxiety, depression, and a general sense of alienation, particularly among young women. To help us figure out what's going on here, I'm delighted to be joined by journalist and author of the new book, Girls, Gen Z and the Commodification of Everything, Freya India. Hi, Freya, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Freya, your book focuses on this premise that young women aren't just consumers of the internet world that they've grown up in, they're actually the product of it. So before we get into your book and all of the really insightful points that you make, could you tell us a bit about your journey thinking and writing about these things and where that all began for you?
Yeah, it was very much a journey of feelings rather than intellect. So I came to it through feeling very anxious, and really the dominant feeling for me growing up was that I couldn't cope with some of these things and that other young women seemed to cope fine. So I really felt like that as a teenager. And then as I got into my late teens, I started to read about the mental health crisis, and psychologists were kind of mapping out the rising rates of anxiety and depression. And I started to realize that maybe this is not just me. And then basically the book just started with me trying to map out what it could be causing this anxiety. And I basically found that a lot of the things that were making me feel insecure or anxious had sort of a link between them. And I felt that that link was commodification, that the market had intruded on every experience that I was having as a teenager. And that the sort of dominant experience for me growing up was marketing myself like a product. And I do think that that makes everyone feel anxious and miserable, but particularly young women.
And I think that when young women who've grown up in this kind of internet sphere on social media during this technological boom of the early 2000s, a lot of the time they tried to talk to their parents or the older generation about it, only to be told, you know, everyone's insecure at your age. You'll grow out of that. But what you point out in the book is that this is actually quite unprecedented, what Gen Z girls are going through. This is a level of self-loathing that we haven't really seen before in older generations. Can you speak a bit to how that manifests?
Yeah, I think that was the major response I had when I was younger, which was that this is normal, this is just girlhood, this is just coming of age. But I was noticing not only that I felt really anxious, but that sort of girls at my school would be cutting themselves, starving themselves. And some of their teenage memories were literally being hospitalized for eating disorders and feeling such intense distress with everyday things like socializing or relationships. And so I just had this nagging feeling that this is not the same as previous generations. But that's not to say that we have it worse than any other generation. So I try to make it clear in the book that it's not necessarily that this is the hardest time to grow up, but it's very different. And I think that really adds to the anxiety of our generation, because not only is it really different, not only is it really intense, but we don't really have the words or the language to describe what's happening because it's so new. And so when I was just kind of going through my memories for the book, I was realizing that actually some of these experiences, I couldn't even communicate to my parents because it was just such a new platform or trend or technology that I didn't even have the words to describe what it was doing to me.
And I wonder how much of a role that influencers and influencer culture plays in that, because you and I would have grown up with the first sort of beauty influencers who are lovely but very clearly trying to sell you something. And then as it's become more brave to speak out about mental health issues, we've had the mental health influencers who are also trying to sell you something but a bit more sneakily, as it were. How do you see those kind of parasocial relationships having an effect on young women?
Yeah, so that's one thing that I think is really different about our generation. So I think that a lot of the trends I talk about in the book were maybe happening to other generations, say family breakdown, or, not having a sense of community or neighbors. These things have been happening for a long time. But I think with our generation, we're the first to have so many substitutes sold to us and so many ways of simulating the thing that was lost. And so I think that that really affected me when I was younger, because I would basically replace any social interaction with the easy, convenient option, because I was a shy teenage girl. And so it was very easy for me to sort of sit inside and watch YouTube instead of meeting up with friends. And it gives you that little hit of connection, even though it's not the real thing. And so, sort of part of the book was to remind myself and other young women that these are substitutes, they're actually replacements for something real. And I think if you've grown up with them, it's very easy to forget what you're simulating in the first place.
And what is that thing that we've lost that you're talking about? Is this like a family breakdown, an immediate community thing?
I kind of describe it as a sort of foundation. So um, I think social media is bad, but the reason I think it's so bad for this generation is that we've lost a sort of floor and a foundation. So things like having a community, having a sense of right and wrong, maybe from religion or from, sort of shared milestones that every other young person is going through. Yeah, and things like family breakdown, losing your stable foundation at home, friends, so much of the research in the book shows that we have far fewer friends than even older generations have. And so basically the argument is that we lost things to hold on to that give you stability and grounding. And then when the social media platforms came along, they absolutely destroyed a generation, especially if you have a personality similar to mine at that age. If you were really shy or anxious or insecure, then without the foundation, these platforms can just completely take over the experience of growing up.
And we're seeing this huge rise of mental health diagnoses in young women in particular. And as a result, and in a way that's a bit more sinister, we're seeing the mass medicalisation of young women for anxiety disorders, for depressive disorders. What I struggle to put my finger on is, are we actually dealing with an anxiety and depression epidemic, or are we just giving girls drugs for a very human response to being plugged in all the time?
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's something I sort of wrestled with in the book and was going back and forth. But I actually think it's both at the same time, which is a even worse prospect, because it's putting girls through a very difficult, confusing world, and then when they can't cope with it, diagnosing them. And so I do think actually that a lot of young people are dealing with serious anxiety. The emotion that they're feeling is really real. So when they say they're socially anxious, they really are socially anxious. They really are feeling it. It's not just, an attempt for attention or victimhood. But I think they're feeling it because of the world they're growing up in, rather than a disorder that they have. And so I tried to lay out the context of, if you are in your 20s now, you grew up with less face-to-face interaction than any other generation in history. I talk about the pandemic. I talk about even before the pandemic, growing up on Instagram and YouTube and all of these substitutes, as I said. And so I think it can be both at the same time, that a generation is really suffering. But I think a part of that suffering is medicalizing their normal distress and their normal, as you say, human responses to things.
I did want to ask you about dating and relationships. You talk about this in the book. We know Gen Z are having fewer romantic relationships. They're also having fewer, they have fewer cross-gender friendships, which is very interesting. Um, why do you suspect that this is happening? Why are Gen Z finding it hard to go on normal dates and meet people of the opposite sex the way their parents would have?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is growing up online, because growing up online teaches you to communicate in a very different way. And so as I was writing the book, I was realizing that the online world is so controlled. So you're growing up in an environment where you can sort of rehearse and edit everything you say and how you come across before you present yourself to the world. And I think that really stunts your ability to then socialize as you get older, because socializing seems to be much higher stakes. It's live. You can't edit yourself. You can't really control how other people perceive you. And I think this is what I struggled with when I was growing up, which is that I had to kind of learn to socialize mostly online. And then you have all this catching up to do. And I think that's kind of what I try and get across to younger girls in the book, is that these things come with a cost. They're really convenient, but they are teaching you to communicate in ways that aren't necessarily human, that don't have the friction and the complication of a real life relationship. And if you are going to pursue real life relationships, you're going to need practice. And I think that's really what our generation didn't get as much of, which is just practice socializing.
And when it comes to the way we look at relationships or the way we're told to look at relationships, do you think there's been something detrimental in that? I mean, a lot of Gen Z actually didn't grow up in two-parent households. Do you think that that's had a knock-on effect on how we view romantic love and what it should look like?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of things at once. So one would be the family breakdown and not seeing, good examples of relationships and stable family structure. But I think also if you're then growing up online, you're seeing sort of the worst examples of relationships. So you can be growing up reading, like hot takes on men and women and the gender discourse before you've even tried to have a relationship. And so I think that becomes very confusing for young people. I also think that the sort of central thesis of the book, that we're turning into products, also then affects relationships, because you start to view other people as products, and you're not only expecting perfection in yourself, perfection in other people. And I think there's an element of that to our generation and dating, where we sort of expect everything to be perfect, and if it's not, it's a red flag, and we can pathologize it and diagnose it. And I think the key theme of the book kind of ended up being risk aversion. And I think that plays throughout the chapters, but especially dating and relationships, this sort of expectation of perfection, and then growing up a lot of the time with divorced parents creates this fear and risk aversion around commitment.
And do you think there's been a knock-on effect of young women and young men increasingly growing up in different online spheres? I mean, they're not really meeting each other in real life. And then we know that they're generally using different online platforms to each other, consuming different political content, they're voting differently. Do you think that that's had an effect in that we're not really looking at one generation's culture, we're looking at a generation split in two across gender lines?
Yeah, that's such a good point. I definitely think that's happening. I actually noticed that when I've spoken to young men about the book, and they're all so convinced that young men have it harder than ever and girls don't suffer at all. And then when I speak to girls, they think the opposite. They think men don't suffer at all, and it's actually girls that, really struggle with dating and relationships in this kind of modern world. And I think a part of that is because we are, as you say, sort of siloed into two different worlds. And then the algorithms are sort of categorizing you by your gender along with other characteristics. And so you're getting a completely different worldview. And as I say, if you're 13, you're getting a worldview maybe about, men being evil, relationships never working, before you've even really had much interaction with the opposite sex. And so I try to get across in the book, although it's mostly about young women, I do touch on that both sides are sort of doing this. So you have female influencers who are saying men are all evil, don't ever commit to a man, be an independent woman. But then you also have male influencers saying women are all selfish and self-obsessed, don't ever commit to a woman. And I think both genders are getting this really risk-averse messaging and being told to avoid vulnerability at all costs.
Something else interesting you mentioned in the book was this idea of performative activism, which we talk about a lot on Spiked. We call it out a lot. You actually had quite a compassionate view on this, I think. I think we agree that maybe young women are quite susceptible to, pressure to virtue signal, or this idea, especially in sort of 2020 era, of post about this issue or you're a bad person. Why do you think that's happened? Why are young women so keen to signal being a good person online?
Yeah, I think it's a classic sort of teenage girl mentality that, you want to fit in, you want to feel popular. And more than anything, I think you want to be seen as a good person, and it can be very easily weaponized against you that you're not a good person, or you're outdated, or you're being offensive. And so I kind of wanted to tell the story of 2020 and the sort of online activism through the perspective of being a teenager, because I feel like there's been so much said about it, but people don't really understand why young women were so, were driving the online activism and the black squares and everything you had to post. And so I show that not only were, girls targeting each other in their friendship groups, are you monitoring what each other's posting, and are you posting quick enough, and what are you saying? But they were also watching celebrities that they often idolize getting absolutely destroyed for saying the wrong thing, being told that they're bad people. And so I think if you are a teenage girl who's agreeable, who wants to please people and fit in, the pressure at that time to just signal that you are the right person, you're doing the right thing. And I put it in the context of we were already documenting everything else. So you're already documenting your personal life and your relationships. And so if you're silent about Black Lives Matter or whatever political issue is happening in the world, it looks very, it looks like you're doing it on purpose, that you disagree with those things. And so I'm trying to get across how it affects you to grow up like that, where your morality is sort of measurable and people are judging you based on sometimes what you don't post. Just not posting at all is the most evil thing. And so I wanted to get across the pressure of that on young girls, especially.
I think a lot of the pushback that those young activists online got was this is actually the best time in history to be a young woman in the West. There's not much to complain about. When it comes to your book, do you think that this is a geographically rooted problem, or do you see this stuff happening outside of the West as well?
I think the book itself is mostly sort of an Anglosphere problem. And I would say, as I say in the book, it's not every young woman, but I do think it describes, young women in the Anglosphere sort of growing up in what I would describe as a liberal, broadly secular world. And so a lot of the stats in the book, teenagers who are growing up in conservative and religious households tend to have done better in terms of the whole mental health crisis. There seemed to be a sort of protective effect, again, of some of these foundations. And so I'm really talking about girls that are less rooted and have less of these, less of this grounding. So as we said, stable families, communities. And I felt that that was sort of missing. So there were a lot of books, talking about the benefits of having a sense of right and wrong and communities of religious leaders, but they were written from a perspective of people who grew up conservative and religious. And as I said at the beginning, I was writing this book from a place of feeling, and I didn't grow up with any of those things. And I just realized through writing it that a lot of those girls were doing better. And so that's really who the book is for. It's for girls growing up in the Anglosphere, feeling lost and kind of rootless, and showing them that actually maybe there are things that we're missing that we've been told are oppressive or old-fashioned or unnecessary anymore, and kind of looking at that from a perspective of someone who didn't grow up with them.
We mentioned before that you and lots of other young women had tried to talk to their parents growing up and had very well-meaning parents who wanted to help, but who could never really grasp what it was like to grow up during that era or to live your life online. Are there any sort of frequent misunderstandings that come up when you talk to older generations about your book, or advice that you'd really like to impart to parents or teachers about this stuff?
Yeah, I actually think one misunderstanding is that a lot of older generations think it's about being a victim. So just by describing what's happened, you're saying that you need to wallow in it and feel really sorry for yourself and you have it harder than everybody else. And I think that's not necessarily true. I think in order to have agency and to do something about it, it really helps to have it laid out. At least it did for me, because I felt I was so caught up in it, I couldn't even see what the problem was. And so sometimes when I describe the book to older generations, I think they get the sense that, it's just constant doom and gloom. And I'm saying that, young women have it harder than ever before, which is not true. It's just to lay out the context. And I think once you have the context, then you can actually make better decisions. And that's what I really wanted to do with the book, because I felt that there are a load of sort of male self-improvement influencers, but there's not really the same for young women that are telling them how they can feel better and how they can, improve their lives. And so I wanted to lay out, all of the influences and industries that I think are getting in the way of feeling better, so that young women can actually feel empowered to make a change.
Do you feel like there is a universe where young women could have a really positive relationship with the internet and with social media and not need to unplug completely from it in order to feel okay? Or do you think that we should really be just deactivating our accounts and living life in reality 100% of the time?
Yeah, I actually do think there's a healthy relationship. So a lot of people say that I'm I'm saying log off completely, which is not actually true, because, you know, I'm on Substack, I post my writing online. I actually think it's amazing that everyone, but especially young women, can commodify their work online, and have a more sort of flexible work from home life by being able to, say, publish your writing on the internet, or, you know, pursue any sort of work online. But where I draw the line, and where I do think it's damaging, is when you're commodifying yourself as a product. And so I kind of give examples in the book of noticing when you're doing that, noticing when you are the thing that's being ranked and reviewed, not your work, or what you're offering up to the market. You know, if it's your most intimate relationships and memories, that's where I think it becomes very bad for your mental health, and you put yourself in a very vulnerable position. And so I would say you can have a healthy relationship with social media, but I think it's drawing lines where you'll share your personal life and how much of it you're going to give to an audience of strangers.
The final thing I wanted to ask you, Freya, is do we have cause to be positive here? Do you feel that young women in Gen Z are sort of waking up to the way that we've been commodified by the internet and saying there's going to be a better way than this? We've got to interact differently.
Yeah, no, I actually am quite positive, even though the book is not positive. I actually am, and actually some of that positivity has come from not only responses to the book, but some of the things I've written on Substack. I haven't just had a response from young women; it's sometimes young men who, you know, want to help young women, or they have girlfriends that they want to understand what she's going through more. Fathers as well. I get quite a lot of response from fathers who are raising girls, and I just think that's very different. It's very positive. And when I hear from young women, it's not just, you know, conservative, religious young women. It's all kinds of young women that are just trying to figure out why they feel anxious and what they can do about it. And so that gives me a lot of hope. And I think that the conversation in general is changing, and even now, older generations are much more willing to have the conversation than they used to be. And I think our generation, I hope, will parent a little bit differently when it comes to social media, just because of what we've gone through. And I think that's the sort of positive change we can take from it. So maybe our childhood has gone now, you know, we've grown up, but I think that we can play a role in protecting the next generation because we're so aware of what these technologies can do.
Freya India, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.